The Sunday school lesson for September the 15th, 2024 is Hezekiah's prayer. 2 Kings chapter 19, verses 14 through 20 and verses 29 through 31. Welcome, viewers and subscribers to my channel, Read With Me. I am Audrey. If you are new here, please know that this is an audio reading of the lesson with intermittent commentary. Verses 14 through 15. Hezekiah received the letter from the messengers and read it. Then he went up to the temple of the Lord and spread it out before the Lord. And Hezekiah prayed to the Lord, Lord, the God of Israel, enthroned between the cherubim, you alone are God over all the kingdoms of the earth. You have made heaven and earth. Hezekiah's prayer, a preparation. Hezekiah received the letter from the messengers and read it. The contents of the letter that Hezekiah received are found in 2 Kings chapter 19, verses 10 through 13. The letter is only about 100 words long in English and 60 in Hebrew. Its contents are threatening. The hostile sender was Sennacherib of Assyria. Being able to read and write was unusual at the time, although Israel's leaders apparently were all literate. Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 18 through 19, and 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 14, 2 Kings chapter 5, verses 4 through 7, chapter 10, verses 2 through 7, and Jeremiah chapter 36, verses 11 through 15. The temple of the Lord is the temple in Jerusalem. The point of departure for King Hezekiah regarding the task we see here was likely his nearby palace. The phrase went up when referring to travel to the temple was generally accurate, as the temple sat at a higher elevation than most other landmarks. Isaiah chapter 37, verse 14, and Jeremiah chapter 26, verse 10. Hezekiah's prayer invites us to reflect on God's names. At the most foundational level, you may find it surprising that God is known by 3 single word names. When they are transliterated, that's where you swap letters of the Hebrew alphabet for similar sounding letters in English. Those 3 names are Yahweh, Elohim, and Adonai. But what about all those lists on the internet that claim 16 names of God, God's 20 names, and so on? Most entries in such lists consist of one of the 3 names mentioned above combined with a descriptor. In the text at hand, the phrase Lord God translates both the names Yahweh and Elohim. The longer phrase Lord, the God of Israel, adds a descriptor. That exact phrase is not rare. It occurs in more than 100 places in the Old Testament. Another descriptor is added with God's dwelling between the cherubim. 1 Samuel chapter 4, verse 4. The creatures known by that designation are mentioned dozens of times in the Old Testament. The most familiar discussion of cherubim is in conjunction with the Ark of the Covenant and the place to meet with God. Exodus chapter 25, verses 17 through 22, and chapter 37, verses 6 through 9. The word translated enthroned refers to a place where someone in authority sits, such as a throne or judgment seat. Exodus chapter 18, verses 13 through 14, Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 4, Judges chapter 4, verse 5, 1 Kings chapter 1, verses 46 through 48, and chapter 2, verse 12 and verse 19. The idea that God figuratively dwells in a place on earth is reflected in Exodus chapter 15, verse 17, 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 13, Psalms 132, verses 13 through 14, and so on. affirming that this concept is not intended to be interpreted in a literal sense, are 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 27, verse 30, verse 39, verse 43, and verse 49, and Acts chapter 17, verse 24. King Sennacherib of Assyria had claimed that other nations and their gods were powerless to stop his army, 2 Kings chapter 18 verses 19 through 35. However, Hezekiah knew that the only true God was indeed God over all the kingdoms of the earth. This status necessarily derives from his role as creator. The phrase, "You have made heaven and earth," is reminiscent of Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. But Hezekiah was not quoting that passage. Rather, the text shows the idea that all things are part of the Lord's creation, and therefore all things are subject to the Lord. Creation implies ownership. That idea lay at the heart of Israel's confession. Verses 16 through 17. Give ear, Lord, and hear. Open your eyes, Lord, and see. Listen to the words Sennacherib has sent to ridicule the living God. It is true, Lord, that the Assyrian kings have laid waste these nations and their lands. The language here is anthropomorphic, which means attributing human characteristics, having ear, eyes, etc. to God. He knows all things, 1 John 3 and 20. Psalms of lament frequently ask God to hear the petitioner's cry, Psalms 4 verse 1, Psalm 64 verse 1, or to look at situations, Psalm 35 verse 17. Sometimes he chooses to reject positively on that awareness, Exodus chapter 3 verse 7, sometimes in a negative way, Jeremiah chapter 7 verses 16 through 20. To ridicule the living God is to mock or taunt him. Sennacherib did this through his officers, 2 Kings chapter 18 verse 35. Could there be a greater blasphemy? Sennacherib was at least partly right. The Assyrian kings had indeed laid waste these nations and their lands, 2 Kings chapter 17 through chapter 18. Since the Assyrians had been able to do this, it logically follows that the gods of the conquered nations were powerless, therefore fit only for the fire, Deuteronomy chapter 4 verse 28. The fact that an invader could destroy the idols proved their impotence. On this point, Hezekiah agrees with Sennacherib, but then the question was whether Sennacherib could defeat the Lord. Verses 18 through 19. They have thrown their gods into the fire and destroyed them, for they were not gods, but only wood and stone, fashioned by human hands. Now, Lord our God, deliver us from his hand, so that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone, Lord, are God. Verse 19 tells us that Hezekiah closed his prayer with the desire that God would triumph over the invaders. Sennacherib had rightly claimed to be superior in his encounters with foreign powers. Nevertheless, the survival of Jerusalem would prove the superiority of Judah's God to all others. Hezekiah wished all the nations to know about that superiority. This theme appears at many points in the Old Testament when Israel sought, or should have sought, to extol God before the Gentiles. 1 Kings chapter 8, verses 41 through 43, 1 Chronicles chapter 16, verses 23 through 29, and Isaiah chapter 49, verse 6. But Israel would not succeed in that task unless the nation stopped profaning the name of the Lord in the sight of the kingdoms of the earth. Ezekiel chapter 20, verse 9, verse 14, and verse 22. Chapter 36, verses 20 through 23, and chapter 39, verse 7. Verse 20. Then Isaiah, son of Amoz, sent a message to Hezekiah. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says: I have heard your prayer concerning Sennacherib, king of Assyria. The material in the 8 verses following this one gives God's full response to Hezekiah's request. The verse at hand is the preface to those 8. It notifies Hezekiah that God has heard. For God to hear also implies a willingness to heed, quoting Isaiah chapter 6, verses 9 through 10. Verse 29. This will be the sign for you, Hezekiah. This year you will eat what grows by itself, and the second year what springs from that. But in the third year sow and reap, plant vineyards and eat their fruit. This part of Hezekiah's prayer is the other bookend to 2 Kings chapter 19, verses 21 through 28. Those verses taunt the Assyrian king, throwing his boast of conquest back in his face. The eventual defeat of the Assyrian army would mean a return to normal agriculture over time. The Assyrians were adept at siege warfare. Excuse me. 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 5. And this time consuming tactic led to the destruction of vineyards, orchards, etc., as the invaders foraged and otherwise lived off the land during the siege. A liberated land therefore required time to restore agriculture. The first 2 years depicted here echo Leviticus chapter 25, verse 5. These 2 years would require faith as survivors of the war scrambled for food. Faith requires long-term thinking. Surely, this points to God's profound care for the people of Jerusalem and Judah. Their nation would survive one of the most desperate moments in their long history, despite all earthly odds. Verses 30 through 31. Once more, a remnant of the kingdom of Judah will take root below and bear fruit above. For out of Jerusalem will come a remnant, and out of Mount Zion a band of survivors. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. By referring to a remnant, God's response acknowledged that not all Judeans would escape what was to come, yet a kernel of the nation would survive and flourish. Zephaniah chapter 2, verses 6 through 7. The verse before us, therefore, moves from an earthly sense of the text just before it to one of the projected imagery that includes spiritual robustness, Isaiah chapter 11. The prophet Isaiah even named his son Shear Jashub, which means a remnant will return. This concept is so important that it has given rise to a subfield of study today known as the doctrine of the remnant. Here we see an intense instance of parallelism in verse 31a that characterizes Hebrew poetry. The use of the parallelism is evident in the repetition of similar ideas using different yet connected words. Thus, the house of Judah from the previous verse parallels Jerusalem here. The identical English words remnant in these 2 verses hides the fact that the words are different in Hebrew, one being a verb and the other one being a noun. The parallelism sometimes continue with the band of survivors reflecting the previous 2 instances of remnant. Mount Zion, for its part, is parallel to the previous kingdom of Judah and Jerusalem. In addition to the parallel text of Isaiah chapter 37-32, this phrase is reflected in Isaiah 9 and 7. The Lord Almighty designation is one of the combination name and descriptors discussed earlier. Interestingly, the word zeal is virtually synonymous with the word jealousy. We usually think of jealousy as a negative thing, but it can be positive when the fervency zeal is appropriately motivated and informed. We see the positive side in John 2:17 and the opposite in Philippians 3 and 6. A brief summary. When Hezekiah read the letter, he went to the temple and spread it out before the Lord. signifying Hezekiah's reliance on God. Judah's army was no match for the huge forces of Assyria. He began to pray, beginning with an acknowledgement of who God is. He understood that Jehovah was not only Lord, the God of Israel, but also the only real God over all the kingdoms of the earth. He had made heaven and earth. The Assyrian armies were a part of his creation, and he could control them. Then Hezekiah begged the Lord to take both look and listen, that is, to give full attention to the words Sennacherib had sent to ridicule the living God by declaring that God could no more save Judah than the imaginary gods of other countries could save those nations. Verses 10 through 13. Sennacherib boasted that Assyrian kings had captured many cities. Chapter 18, verse 33, verse 34, and chapter 19, verse 12 and verse 13, and had destroyed the so-called gods of other nations. Since those gods had not saved their people, could the Lord be expected to save his people? Hezekiah had a clearer understanding. He knew the destroyed gods were only wood and stone images carved by men. The Lord was not made by men. Instead, he made men and everything else in the earth and sky. So Hezekiah begged the Lord to deliver them, but not for their sake alone. A decisive victory over the mighty Assyrians would bring honor to God and would let everyone know that Jehovah was not like the powerless idols worshipped in pagan nations. After Hezekiah's prayer, the Lord sent him a message through Isaiah. I have heard, which implied that God not only received Hezekiah's prayer, but would give a favorable answer. Then Isaiah spoke the Lord's word to the Assyrians. Jerusalem despises you and mocks you. Who is it you have ridiculed and blasphemed? The Lord controls what happens in the world, and because of their haughtiness against him, he will send them back the way they came. Then Isaiah told Hezekiah that his people would have to live for a while on what grows by itself. But after that, they would again plant and harvest, and the remnant of Jerusalem would prosper in the land. Jerusalem was safe from any attack. Thank you so very much for listening. Join me soon for the next reading of the lesson with intermittent commentary. And remember, every Sunday at 1 o'clock Central Standard Time, I release the audio for the upcoming Sunday school lesson. Stay safe and be blessed.